In today's video, I'm going to tell you why I reckon the most affordable Porsche Taycan that you can buy is actually the best. Well, the Taycan comes in very spendy variants, right up to the Turbo S that can cost you the best part of $500,000 here in Australia. This $156,000 single motor rear-wheel drive Taycan is all you need, and in a lot of ways it's actually the best Taycan to drive because the nose is as light as it gets in one of these cars and the steering is as good as it gets as a result. But we'll talk more about that when we take this rear-wheel drive Taycan out onto the roads here on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland and we can really see what's what. Before we get to that point though, we'll see exactly what it is you get on a base Porsche Taycan, for want of a better word. Now, this thing might start at 156 grand, and what you see here is basically kind of that price from the outside, including these little 19-inch wheels that give it a good ride quality, even though this one doesn't have air suspension. But there are lots of options on this car still. Porsche assured us that it was lightly optioned. That actually translates to $40,000 worth of options, but most of those you don't actually need. I'm gonna go through in today's video how I would spec a base Taycan to keep the price down and keep the enjoyment up. So we'll jump inside, we'll check out the front and rear cabin of this vehicle that's been very tastefully specified in cherry metallic outside. We'll check out the boot space, discuss the running costs of the vehicle, and then we'll get out onto the road in the rear-wheel drive 2022 Porsche Taycan sedan to see what the dynamics are like. And then I'll give you my verdict. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below the video. When you're buying a Taycan, you can go super indulgent, and I get that because this is a fabulous electric car. We reviewed a bunch of Taycan variants already, and it's well and truly settled that this is one of the best EVs that money can buy. But if you were going to go indulgent, you should go something like a 4S or a Turbo Cross Turismo with heaps of options and just go nuts. Here in the base model Taycan, the goal is actually to keep the cost down. Okay, 156 grand isn't a cheap car. I'm not going to pretend that it is, but it's a lot of car for the money. And I think optioning up a base model to like well over $200,000 is probably not necessary. So this one that I'm sitting in here, this nice handsome cherry car, is $194,800 plus on-road costs, but a whole bunch of the stuff you can skip. The big option on this car is the 12 grand Performance Battery Plus, which takes the range from about 360 kilometers to about 430 kilometers. And we've routinely been able to match Porsche's range and consumption claims. So if those extra 60 or 70 Ks of range mean a lot to you, then spend the 12 grand. You also get a little bit more power, not night and day, but there is a slight bump in power from that. So I'd consider it. LED matrix main headlights, they're just over 3 grand. Maybe you do it. You probably won't need the 22 kilowatt AC. Most people will be fine with standard 11 kilowatt, and that's 3,500 you save. Another 3,500 you can save by not getting the panoramic sunroof because it doesn't open and it just beats the sun down into the cabin, which is not appropriate for Australia. So I'd skip that anyway. So I've already saved you 7 grand. The Bose, that's 3 grand. You probably want it. It's not the best stereo I've ever heard. I'd probably consider upgrading to the Burmester because I'm a bit of an audiophile, but the Bose is fine. Cherry metallic 2300, very nice color. Here's another couple. Electric charging cover for 1,300 and the 4+1 seating for 1,000. Skip both of those. The charging cover, I don't think anyone's going to suffer if it pops up manually, and the 4+1, the middle seat is so tiny, as you'll see in a moment. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. So you can actually get this car to about 165 to 170 grand before on-road costs very easily, and you're buying a super nice luxury car. Leather seats are standard. This car has the worthwhile $800 18-way seats, probably the best value option on the car, with adjustable side bolsters, adjustable thigh bolsters, 4-way lumbar. It's all happening. Very comfortable seat and a good driving position. Behind this beautiful little steering wheel, thin rim, it's not too big, delicate little spokes, gorgeous wheel. Interesting thing is there's actually no dedicated skip backwards and forwards buttons on most Porsches, but you can program the little diamond button to skip your music forward, which is cool. And then you look ahead at an amazing curved display. You can chuck a satellite map in there so you know exactly where you're going and what kind of terrain you're driving on. Otherwise, you can bring up your trip computer, media, or a mix of all of the three, basically. Over here in the center, we've got a snappy touchscreen with good processing power behind it, wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. And we have plenty of media options. I've mentioned the Bose stereo, which is of acceptable quality in this car, which I probably would go for, if not the Burmester. That's all easy to use. This car doesn't have the optional passenger display that we've seen on a bunch of Taycans that have come through the Chasing Cars garage. So if you've got a passenger that likes fiddling with screens, you might want to consider optioning that. And then we've got another display down here for the climate control, the seat heaters, and the sport mode, because this car doesn't have sport chrono, so we don't have the Manettino on the steering wheel to change the drive modes, but this all works fine. One further upgrade I would consider though is ventilated seats. Even though this car has handsome beige leather, it's a pretty hot day up in Queensland today, and ventilated seats would have been even nicer, but we are really talking about luxuries now, aren't we? Storage in the cabin, it's all right. We've got 2 cup holders, big bin between the seats with USB-C, flock-lined door bins as well. And of course, you've got the fact that this car has double cargo space in the boot and the front, which we'll check out in a sec. So up front, the Taycan continues to be comfortable, luxurious, good looking and easy to use actually. Let's check out the back seat. The back seat of the Taycan is perfectly acceptable for what most people are going to require of it. Porsche Australia tells us that a lot of their customers with a Cayenne are buying a Taycan to be kind of like the electric sports car in the garage as well. So to be honest, there are a few customers who are going to be using this as their only family car. But even if you had to do that, there's more than enough room. I'm 6 foot, headroom is just enough underneath the panoramic roof. And if you didn't have that, you'd get slightly more headroom as well. Legroom's fine. It's actually tow room, which is the compromise bit, and that's because we're sitting on the battery. The Taycan uses the Volkswagen Group J1 platform, which is a skateboard electric vehicle platform. So there's a battery underneath us, which keeps the floor height a little bit high. Thankfully, the seat base is inclined enough, so it does support your legs here in the back. It's not super uncomfortable, but as a result, you get these sort of bolsters for the outboard seats, which render the middle seat virtually unusable, meaning the 4+1 option for $1,000 is just setting cash on fire. So don't bother doing it. Just accept this car as a comfortable 4-seater. And it is that, because we've got air vents back here, plush and high quality materials in the back, and also 2 cup holders in this flip down armrest. But what about cargo carrying with the Taycan? Well, if you want to do a lot of that, you should opt for the Cross Turismo wagon version of this vehicle that does about 25% of Taycan sales in Australia. But if you prefer more of a 3-box sedan, this is what we've got here. And in fact, you can't get a rear-wheel drive Cross Turismo. So if you just want a single motor on the rear axle, the lightest possible Taycan, you'll be getting this car. Now, power tailgate opens up to reveal 407 litres of space, which is actually about 10% more than the dual motor version of this car. I'm not entirely sure how they managed to do that, given there's still a single motor here on the rear axle, but there you go. And if you go to the Cross Turismo wagon, you get another 10% boot space underneath the window line, and of course, a more vertical rear of the vehicle, so it's more practical all round. Now, within the boot, we've got a couple of little storage cubbies, 12-volt socket, and some underfloor storage for your charging cables. However, this vehicle has the beefier 22 kilowatt AC setup, which has been stored in a Velcro bag in the boot. Most people won't need to carry that around with them all the time, though. Now we have controls here on the carpeted boot lid to close the boot or to close it and lock the vehicle. But in actual fact, the Taycan has secret extra cargo space. And don't forget about the frunk, which sits under what would have been a conventional bonnet if this car was combustion, and behind this curved front end, which like most Porsches really seems to attract stone chips. So you'll want to get a clear PPF wrap for the front end of this car at least. Anyway, this is where you find your 84-litre cargo space in the front. It's really nicely finished. It's carpeted and insulated. You can get a small roll-on suitcase in here, European size, that you'd get into the overhead bin of like an Airbus A320. You'll get that into a Porsche Taycan. You also find the outlet for your windscreen wiper liquid, your warning triangle and brake fluid as well under here, and better access to the wipers. And then closing it, just like a combustion car, it's just a matter of latching it manually. So what's it going to cost you to run a Porsche Taycan with rear-wheel drive? Well, the first cost is energy consumption, which is actually quite a bit less on the rear-wheel drive version of the Taycan when you compare it to the dual-motor all-wheel drive variants that we've tested pretty extensively. The all-wheel drive Taycans use pretty much 22 to 23 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers no matter what, but I was easily able to get 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers out of the rear-wheel drive Taycan. So it's kind of 10-15% more economical than the all-wheel drive in the same circumstances. I did back-to-back it today with a dual motor version as well, just to check that. The cost to recharge this Taycan is really going to differ depending on your setup. If your home has a significant solar array, for instance, you could be able to refuel the Taycan day to day for free or virtually free. However, if you're paying regular electricity prices, which at the moment in New South Wales average about 25 cents per kilowatt hour, then you're going to be looking at about 20 bucks to completely recharge the Taycan's 83.7 kilowatt hour performance battery plus from empty to full. But ultra rapid charging, you get a nice little deal, because when you buy one of these Taycans from Porsche in Australia, you actually get a 3-year subscription to the ChargeFox ultra rapid network, rapid and ultra rapid, included in the price. So next to the Chasing Cars head office, for instance, there's an array of 350 kilowatt ChargeFox chargers, which the Taycan can tap into at up to 270 kilowatt speeds, and that'll be free for your first 3 years, which is quite a significant value. On to servicing the Taycan. The intervals are 2 years and 30,000 kilometers for this vehicle, and Porsche Australia doesn't do cap price servicing on any of its cars. Service pricing is left up to individual Porsche dealers, and no Porsche dealer has yet published service pricing on the Taycan, so I can't actually tell you what it costs to do scheduled maintenance on this vehicle. What I can tell you though is that the first Taycans delivered in this country will be due for that 2-year service in February next year, so we certainly expect to see pricing published soon, and it should have already been published. Lastly, the warranty on the Taycan is quite poor actually, at 3 years with unlimited kilometers, particularly when you consider this car's platform sharing cousin, the Audi e-tron GT, gets a 5-year warranty. The battery warranty is 8 years, and you can pay Porsche to upgrade your warranty. A 5-year warranty will set you back $3,290, whereas a 7-year warranty will cost you $5,000. They're not cheap, but you certainly do get peace of mind throughout that period. So what is the rear-wheel drive Taycan like to drive? Well, I've really been looking forward to this one because this car has so much promise. While the all-wheel drive Taycans have really changed our view of how an electric car can ride and handle, this is the one that should be the purist special. Sure, it's nowhere near as quick in a straight line as a Taycan Turbo S, for instance, that sits right up the other end of the range, but it should be the most adept for handling and cornering, which in Australia, a country with rigidly enforced speed limits, you're possibly going to have more fun in a Taycan which is attuned, to the max for ride and handling, rather than the one that's designed to get you to 100 kilometers per hour from rest in 2.5 seconds. But let's see if that theory actually holds true in the real world. First of all, let's run down exactly what we're dealing with here. So no matter what Taycan you go for, it's still above 2 tons. These are not light cars. That being said, it's considerably lighter than a dual motor Taycan. So the way it starts is you get a rear-wheel drive Taycan with the performance battery, which is kind of code for the small battery. It's about 75 kilowatt hours, but Porsche Australia expects most people to option the performance battery plus, or the big battery, which is 83.7 kilowatt hours. It's another 80 kilos, but it gives you another 70 kilometers of range, 434 k's of range, and it gives you a little bit more power, 40 kilowatts more power as well, and about 20 newton meters of extra torque as well in the rear wheel drive. But it's going to be that range that kind of makes it attractive to a lot of people. Now, with the standard battery, the Taycan rear wheel drive makes 240 kilowatts of power. With the performance battery plus, you're making 280 kilowatts of power and 357 newton meters of torque. So sort of nice sports sedan outputs, what we would have expected to have seen from like a naturally aspirated straight 6 or V6 engine in the combustion era. So definitely a nice amount of power and torque, but it does pale in comparison to the dual motor. The 4S, which is about $40,000 more than this car, makes 360 kilowatts of power with the performance battery plus and 650 newton meters of torque. So we're down like 300 newton meters of torque here, which is noticeable. The base Taycan will still sprint to 100 kilometers per hour from rest in 5.5 seconds or thereabouts, and it feels about that quick. it's a nice level of pace in this car rather than the sort of blistering acceleration which we are used to experiencing in, you know, most electric cars that cost six figures and virtually every Tesla. It's not quite on that level. Like if I punch the Base Taycan out of an intersection here, the initial burst of speed is not great, but then it really comes on song once you run through about 40 to 50 kilometers per hour. You get a real surge as the overboost wakes up, because on overboost we actually are making 350 kilowatts of power for a short window of time in this car. So the point I want to make about the pace is that it's adequate for most people, but it's really a weight story, this car, because when you go from the small battery to the big battery in the rear drive, you add 80 kilos, and then when you go from the big battery with rear wheel drive to the big battery with 4S, you add another 90 kilos, and so it goes. And also the 4S, the weight distribution is the majority of weight over the front and not the back. It's about 51 front, 49 back. However, both the small battery and the big battery rear wheel drive have the majority of their weight over the back. So this car automatically on paper looks like the Purist Special. It's the lightest Taycan you can get. It relieves the front axle of 90 kilograms that doesn't really need to be there, and as such you get two main effects with the handling of this car. The first one is that the nose is noticeably lighter than the Taycan 4S. It really wants to turn in this car. It is terrific in rear wheel drive single motor form. It feels really fleet-footed, agile, totally belies the fact it's a 2-ton car. The front end just wants to turn in, and that's despite the fact that we don't actually have like super aggressive tires on the Base Taycan. Continental Premium Contact 6 or a hand-cooked tire. They've got two sitting on the production line, but they're not like super sports tires at all. The front end has really, really good mechanical grip from the chassis of the car and being relieved of that extra weight compared to the dual motor versions of the Taycan. So that is really, really nice. The other main feature of the handling is that it's super throttle steerable, and you don't have to disengage PSM stability control in order to maximize that. You can nip your line in the corner just by applying additional throttle in the Taycan rear drive. Whereas if you do that in the 4S, while it is rear biased, you're just going to generate a little bit more understeer as the car tries to grip up and push out of the corner with its front wheels providing assistance. We simply don't have that corruption in the rear wheel drive Taycan. Instead, it is just that, distinctly rear driven. The front wheels for the turning and the rear wheels for the accelerating and assisting with the turning with a little bit of oversteer. It's a real pleasure to drive, and you can balance the car and place the car just as you would with a rear wheel drive sports sedan. Or alternatively, you can tap the button on the steering wheel to engage regen mode in the Taycan, and then you can also balance it using the regen, which basically stands in for left foot braking in this car, which is nice. But that brings me on to one of the major differences about the Taycan compared to a rival EV like the Tesla Model S. And that's that this car doesn't have strong regenerative braking as standard. Instead, it has its own system developed by Porsche, which blends the disc brakes and the regen brakes. So when you brake through the pedal, it's actually regen braking, attempting to be modulated through the brake pedal instead of by lifting the throttle. And it really comes down to personal preference. In some EVs, I really like the regen. In my long-term Polestar 2, for instance, I quite like the regen and I have it set to max. But I always enjoy driving a Taycan because they feel so normal. This car is a good sports sedan or sports wagon first and a good electric car second. Sure, foregoing lots of automatic maximum regen probably means that this car's range isn't as good as it could be if every single time you lifted the throttle you got thrown forward in your seat like a Model S with heaps of regen. But when you lift the throttle, it basically freewheels with just a hint of regen at times. It's super consistent, and it just makes this car really easy to maintain pace in a system of corners. It's much more like a regular sports sedan to drive than a Model S is, where you've really got to learn a completely new driving style. And to be honest, I think it's a cool universe where some EVs have like heaps of regen, some are like the Taycan and don't lean into regen as much, because it means there's more choice out there. And as an objective reviewer, I can see the benefits of both, because this car is super satisfying to drive, the way it's been set up. Now, ride quality. That's an important point to differentiate because this car has the smallest possible wheels for a Taycan, 19-inch wheels, chunky tyres as you will have seen from outside the car, but we've got the standard suspension, steel springs with adaptive dampers, and it is comfortable and it's a good ride quality on 19s. I don't know if you option this up to 21, 22-inch wheels, whether the standard suspension would really cope with that. But the way it is on 19s and the standard suspension is fine. It's just that the Taycan, when optioned with adaptive air suspension, is way better than fine. It totally changes the game in terms of ride and handling for an electric car, which is why I think it makes a huge amount of sense on this vehicle to spend the extra it's so oversteery, I love it. Anyway, to spend the extra $4.5 on adaptive air suspension, which just gives this car a super phenomenal ride quality and a freaky ability to corner at speed, keeping the car really, really level. The standard suspension is good enough, it's certainly more than adequate, but the adaptive air is something else entirely, and that is a really good use of $4,500 as an option. I would go that before I went the $12,000 Performance Battery Plus. Like, I would forego the 70 kilometers of range in order to get the air suspension if it came down to that. But ideally, you'll get both, particularly because adding the 80 kilos of the Performance Battery Plus creates an even higher need for the adaptive air suspension. So I would go a base Taycan, adaptive air, maybe Performance Battery Plus, ventilated seats, and then you've got yourself a pretty nice car, 18-way seats as well. You don't have to spend huge, vast amounts of money to get an awesome Taycan, which is cool. Now, in terms of the safety stuff, adaptive cruise is smooth in this vehicle, and the lane centering is bang on the center. It's really, really nicely executed. We've also got blind spot monitoring, which works well, and the reversing camera and the 360-degree camera are clear enough too. Visibility out is acceptable, but not great because the back window is quite tiny. So the ultimate question, should you buy a rear-wheel drive Taycan instead of the 40 grand more expensive 4S? Well, I think that depends on exactly what you plan to do with the car. If you view this as a sports car and you're gonna go out and sniff out the best roads and you're seriously gonna tap into that ultra-light front end, relatively speaking, and the nice oversteery rear end, then yeah, you want to get the rear wheel drive. You want the lightest possible Taycan you can get and the one with the most pure driving dynamics. So for myself, I think I would benefit from going for the rear drive. I don't need 650 Newton meters of torque. I'd prefer a vehicle that was just a real all-round kind of ride and handling special, which this is. That being said, if you want a Taycan that is a commuter, that really leans into the electric bit, flies off the line with vast sums of torque, then a 4S or a turbo is probably going to float your boat, but you start paying a lot more money. The 4S is 194 grand now, and the turbo is like almost 300k, and that's before you start adding options. One variant to consider though is the Taycan 4 Cross Turismo, because you do get more power, you do get more torque, it is dual motor, and you get the Cross Turismo body, which is so attractive. Keep in mind there's no rear-wheel drive Cross Turismo, which is a bit of a shame. That'd probably be the variant of choice if it existed. So those are my opinions on the rear-wheel drive Porsche Taycan, possibly the most rewarding Taycan of all to drive if your goal is maximizing the ride and handling of this chassis rather than just the straight line speed, which is pretty quick, but certainly not as blisteringly fast as the Turbo S, for instance, right up the other end of the range. But for the money, the Taycan rear drive is a pretty spectacular vehicle. I just go a little bit further and get a couple of choice options to really maximize this car, like the adaptive air suspension and the ventilated seats as a little indulgence. Those are my opinions. Let me know yours down below in the comments. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. You can also catch our reviews of the Taycan 4S and the Taycan Turbo up on the channel. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.